If you grew up in Canada in the 70s or 80s, you grew up with Carling O'Keefe, the red and gold Black Label can in your father's hand on a Saturday night, the Mabel barmaid winking out of every back bar sign in every small-town tavern, the Grey Cup broadcasts wrapped in beer commercials, the Nordiques on the ice in Quebec City. At its peak, Carling O'Keefe ran 16 breweries across Canada and employed thousands of unionized workers. The company survived Ontario Prohibition, survived American Prohibition, survived the Depression, 2 World Wars, a federal combine prosecution, British Tobacco taking it over, and Australian brewers taking it over after that. And then, on a single Wednesday morning in January 1989, its arch-rival announced it had bought half the company, and 7 of those breweries were marked for the dark. How does a beer that was in every fridge in the country simply disappear? What happened? Chapter 1. Hey Mabel. The story begins in 2 places at once, 2 centuries ago, separated by 120 miles of Upper Canada bush. In London, Ontario, in the spring of 1840, a Yorkshire farmer named Thomas Carling lit a fire under a copper kettle on Waterloo Street and started selling beer from a wheelbarrow. 22 years later, in Toronto, a 35-year-old bank clerk named Eugene O'Keefe walked away from his desk at the Toronto Savings Bank, pooled his money with 2 partners, and bought a struggling little brewery at the corner of Gould and Victoria Streets. Neither man would ever meet the other. Neither man would ever imagine that their 2 surnames would one day share the front of a beer can. But the company that would carry both their names would become one of the great industrial empires of 20th century Canada. A brewing colossus that owned the Quebec Nordiques, paid for half the Grey Cup broadcasts of the 1980s, and brewed the beer in your father's hand on Saturday nights in front of Hockey Night in Canada. For 149 years, that empire grew. It survived 2 waves of prohibition. It survived 2 world wars. It survived the Great Depression and a federal combine prosecution. It survived being sold to British Tobacco, and then sold again to Australian brewers. It did not survive the morning of January 18, 1989, when its arch-rival in Montreal announced that it had bought half the company, and that within 3 years, 7 of its breweries would go dark, and 1,400 workers would be on the street. But that's the end. The beginning is the wheelbarrow. The beginning is a Yorkshire farmer who came to Canada with his father's ale recipe in his head, and an Irish bank clerk who would one day be made a private chamberlain to the Pope. Chapter 2. A wheelbarrow and a borrowed brewery. Thomas Carling was born in 1797 in the village of Eton, in the East Riding of Yorkshire, 4 miles northwest of Beverley. His father William was a farm laborer. His mother Margaret raised him on the household recipes that Yorkshire women had used for generations, the slow, patient ale that families brewed in their own kitchens through the long northern winters. In 1818, when Thomas was 21, he sailed from the port of Hull on the 17th of May, carrying that recipe in his head, and not much else, bound for Upper Canada. He settled in London Township the following year. He married Margaret Routledge in 1820. He cleared land at Lot 14, Concession 8. He farmed, and he brewed ale in his off hours, the Yorkshire way, with the recipe he'd brought across the Atlantic. His neighbors, the men who helped him clear his land, started showing up at his door. Word traveled. Demand grew. By the late 1830s, Thomas was brewing more than his farm could absorb, and around 1839, he moved his family into the town of London proper, partly so his sons could be properly educated, partly because brewing was about to become his trade. In 1840, he opened a commercial brewery on Waterloo Street, directly opposite the British military garrison. The choice was deliberate. The soldiers were thirsty, and they were steady. The first brewery had 2 potash kettles, 6 men working the mash tubs, and a horse to turn the grinding wheel. Thomas Carling, by then 43 years old, a Yorkshire farmer who had crossed an ocean, sold his beer from a wheelbarrow on London's dirt streets, pushing it cask by cask to the inns and the barracks. Eugene O'Keefe arrived in Canada by a different route. He was born Owen Keefe in Bandon, County Cork, on the 10th of December, 1827, the son of an Irish family that emigrated to Toronto when Eugene was 5 years old in 1832. He was raised in Toronto schools, In 1856, at the age of 28, he took a job as a junior accountant at the Toronto Savings Bank, a Catholic institution founded by Bishop Charbonnel and the Society of St. Vincent de Paul, to give working-class Irish immigrants a place to keep their money safe from the Protestant banks that wouldn't take them. He worked there for 5 years. Then, in 1862, he did something no Toronto bank clerk had done before. He left. He pooled his savings with a Toronto businessman named George Hawke and a master brewer named Patrick Cosgrave, and the three of them bought the Victoria Brewery at the corner of Gould and Victoria, a small operation that had been brewing since 1840, producing about 1,000 barrels a year. Cosgrave left within a year to start his own brewery. Hawke died not long after. By the late 1860s, Eugene O'Keeffe was the sole proprietor of his own brewery and his own future. What Carling had that O'Keeffe didn't was a recipe and a heritage. What O'Keeffe had that Carling didn't was a banker's instinct for modernization. In the early 1870s, while the Carlings in London were still brewing English-style ales, O'Keeffe became one of the first brewers in Canada to introduce lager, the cold fermented German style that required ice, refrigeration, and patience that English ales did not. He bought machine refrigeration. He electrified his plant. He was among the first brewers in the country to switch to the crown cap bottle, and among the first to put his beer on motorized delivery trucks. By 1891, he had incorporated his company as the O'Keeffe Brewery Company of Toronto Limited. By 1911, it was producing 500,000 barrels a year. Thomas Carling did not live to see what his sons would build. He died in February 1880, aged 82, of pneumonia, in the town he had walked into 60 years earlier with nothing but a recipe. By then, he had turned the brewery over to his two sons, John and William, who renamed it W. and J. Carling. A new 5-story brewery was being built. A 7-story malting tower was rising over Waterloo Street. On the 13th of February, 1879, that building burned to the ground. William Carling, the senior technical partner, helped fight the fire through the night, took sick from the cold and smoke, and died of pneumonia not long after. By 1882, the brewery was rebuilt, bigger than before, 300 feet long, rivaling the Labatt Brewery a few blocks away. And the man who would now run it was Thomas Carling's other son. His name was John, and he was about to become one of the most powerful men in Canada. Chapter 3. The Knight and the Banker. John Carling was born in London Township on the 23rd of January, 1828. He grew up in the brewery his father built, but he wanted something else too. And in 1857, while still helping run the family business, he stood for election as a Conservative for London in the Legislative Assembly of the Province of Canada. He won. He kept winning. For 15 years, he sat in 2 legislatures at once, provincial and federal, until the law was changed in 1872 to forbid dual representation. He served as Postmaster General of Canada from 1882 to 1885. He served as Sir John A. Macdonald's Minister of Agriculture from 1885 to 1892. He founded the Dominion Experimental Farm System, which still exists. He helped found the Ontario Agricultural College. He gave the City of London the land for Wolseley Barracks. He was knighted by Queen Victoria in 1893. The brewer was now a cabinet minister. The boy who had grown up on Waterloo Street, watching his father push a wheelbarrow of beer toward the British garrison, now sat at the table where Macdonald drew the lines of the national policy, the tariff wall, raised in 1879, that protected Canadian manufacturing from American competition and made companies like Carling possible. Beer and nation building in that family were not separate things. They were the same thing. Eugene O'Keeffe was building something parallel in Toronto and something different. Where John Carling went into politics, O'Keeffe went into finance. He became president, in 1901, of the institution that would later become the Home Bank of Canada. He was, by the early years of the 20th century, one of the richest men in Toronto, and he poured his fortune into the Catholic Church. He financed St. Monica's Church in 1907 as a memorial to his late wife at a cost of $30,000. He bought the West Presbyterian Church in 1911 and gave it to Toronto's Polish immigrant community as the Church of St. Stanislaus Kostka. He donated $400,000, a sum that in 1913 was an industrial fortune, to build St. Augustine's Seminary on the Scarborough Bluffs. On the 9th of January, 1909, Pope Pius X made him a private chamberlain, the first Canadian layman to receive that honor. In 1911, his only son, Eugene Bailey O'Keefe, died. The old brewer never recovered from it. He sold his interest in the brewery to Hawke's heirs and to Sir Henry Pellet, the man who had just finished building Casa Loma, and poured what remained of his fortune into the seminary. He died at his home on Bond Street on the 1st of October 1913, aged 85. After his death, the brewery passed to a strange little holding company controlled by Pellet, by Sir William Mulock, and by the eccentric Toronto lawyer Charles Vance Miller, the man who would later become famous for the Great Stork Derby, the will that promised his fortune to whichever Toronto woman could have the most babies in a decade. And then, just as both founding families were exiting the stage, Canada changed. Ontario voted to go dry in 1916. By 1919, every province in the country except Quebec had some form of prohibition. The breweries closed their taps to the domestic market. Carling shut its London plant entirely in 1920. O'Keefe survived by brewing near beer, its non-alcoholic star product, and by exporting. Because here was the loophole that saved Canadian brewing. It was illegal to sell beer in Canada, but federal law did not bar Canadian breweries from producing it for export. And just south of the border, the United States went dry in 1922, and stayed dry until 1933. What followed was one of the great quiet bonanzas of Canadian industry. By most estimates, 80% of the beer brewed in Canada during the first 5 years of American Prohibition was bootlegged across the border. Carling prospered, selling to American bootleggers. Bradings of Ottawa survived by selling into the bars in Hull, Quebec. The Bronfman family was building the foundations of Seagram's on the same trade. Beer flowed south, cash flowed north, and the brewery towns kept their workers paid through a decade that broke other industries. But when American Prohibition ended in 1933, and the Canadian provinces gradually returned to regulated sale, the brewing industry that emerged was something different. Overbuilt, heavily indebted, with too many small plants and too many fading brands. By 1930, Carling Breweries Limited was majority owned by the Dominion Bank. The family was out, the bank was in, and the bank was looking for someone to take the brewery off its hands. His name was Edward Plunkett Taylor, and he was about to invent modern Carling O'Keefe. Chapter 4. The Man Who Traded Paper for Paper. E.P. Taylor was born in Ottawa on the 29th of January, 1901, the son of a lieutenant colonel. He went to Ashbury College. He went to McGill, where he studied mechanical engineering and patented a double-sided toaster in his spare time. He joined his maternal family's brewery, Bradings of Ottawa, in 1923 and became its president in 1927 at the age of 26. When the 1929 crash ended the underwriting business he'd been building on the side, he found himself sitting in a Montreal hotel room with a representative of British investors named Clark Jennison, who had $500,000 to spend and was looking for a Canadian industry to consolidate. On the 3rd of March, 1930, Taylor and Jennison incorporated the Brewing Corporation of Ontario by merging Bradings with the Kuntz Brewery of Waterloo. Later that year, Taylor took over the Carling Brewery in London from the Dominion Bank for $600,000, repayable at $100,000 a year. He was 29 years old. He was so cash poor in those first years that there is a story, possibly true, certainly told, of him shuttling checks between Montreal and Toronto bank accounts to keep his payroll from bouncing. He liked to describe his method in later years as trading pieces of paper for other pieces of paper. Through the 1930s and 1940s, he did it more than 20 times. The O'Keefe Brewery in Toronto came in 1934. Plant after plant followed. By the late 1930s, the company was called Canadian Breweries Limited. By the 1950s, Taylor had built it into the largest brewing company in the world, and he had built it through a method that, in any other context, would have been called destruction. He took the more than 100 brand names his 30 acquired breweries had produced and reduced them to 6, He fired the old runners who had sold beer to bootleggers during Prohibition and replaced them with respectable salesmen, encouraged to join Rotary clubs and become community leaders. And he closed plants. He closed breweries the way later executives would close factories, methodically, by the numbers, with the same logic of economies of scale that would one day be turned against the company he was building. He built other things too. He founded Argus Corporation in 1945, a holding company that would come to control Massey Harris, Dominion Stores, Hollinger Mines, British Columbia Forest Products, and Standard Broadcasting through a structure of pyramid ownership so thin he would joke that he simply owned the largest piece of the largest piece. He developed Don Mills outside Toronto, Canada's first model planned suburb. He built Winfield's Farm in Oshawa and bred Northern Dancer, the colt who won the 1964 Kentucky Derby and went on to become arguably the most influential thoroughbred sire of the 20th century. He moved to the Bahamas in 1963, built the Lyford K Club, suffered a stroke in 1980, and never came back to Canada. He died at Lyford K on the 14th of May, 1989, 5 months after the merger that took everything he had built and folded it into Molson. He was 88 years old. There is no record that anyone told him. In the 1950s, federal prosecutors charged Canadian breweries with operating an illegal combine. They lost. The growth of Labatt and Molson, the court found, preserved adequate competition. By 1965, the three companies between them were producing roughly 95% of the beer sold in Canada. The country had its big three. And in 1949, in the United States, Carling licensed the production of a beer called Black Label to a converted Cleveland auto plant, the old Peerless Motor Company, which had failed during the Depression and reinvented itself as the Brewing Corporation of America. The brand was struggling. Then somebody wrote a jingle. "Hey Mabel, Black Label." By 1951, Carling had hired a New York model named Jean Goodspeed to play Mabel, the tray-toting barmaid, in print ads and television commercials and animated spots that ran for nearly 20 years. The whistle of that jingle, 2 syllables and a punchline, became one of the most recognized pieces of beer advertising in North America. The beer flowed back across the border. By 1971, Carling had 7 plants in the United States, and in Canada, a generation of fathers and sons was now drinking the beer their family company had taken across an ocean a century earlier, then sent south, then brought home again. Chapter 5. The Big Three and the Walls Between Provinces. To understand what Carling O'Keeffe was at its peak, you have to understand the country it was selling beer in. Canada, in the 1960s and 1970s, was an industrial archipelago, a string of cities and towns separated by enormous distances, by mountain ranges, by provincial borders that functioned, for the brewing industry, almost like international ones. Every province required that beer sold inside its borders be brewed inside its borders. The taxes on out-of-province beer raised the price by roughly 30%. Taylor himself had written in a confidential memo decades earlier that the immense distance in Canada meant it was not practical for breweries in the East to ship to the West and compete with Western breweries. The answer was to buy 2 or 3 prosperous Western concerns. That is what he did. That is what Labatt did. That is what Molson did. The result was that each of the big three operated not 1 or 2 large efficient plants, but a whole archipelago of small regional ones. By 1980, there were only about 40 breweries left in all of Canada. 8 of them weren't owned by Molson, Labatt, or Carling O'Keeffe. The rest belonged, one way or another, to the 3 companies that between them produced almost every bottle of beer the country drank. For Carling O'Keeffe, the network ran like a steel spine across the country. There was the Vancouver plant in Kitsilano, at 12th and Arbutus, originally built in 1912 as the Vancouver Breweries plant on the site of the old Red Cross Brewery from 1882, acquired by Carling in 1957, producing at its peak more than 2 million hectoliters a year. There was the Calgary plant, the Calgary Brewing and Malting Company, founded in 1892 by A.E. Cross, one of the 4 Stampede founders. The brewery with the buffalo and horseshoe stamped on every label of Calgary beer. There was the Saskatoon plant, descended from the old Drury's brewery. There was the Winnipeg plant, the Redwood Brewery, at 55 Redwood Avenue, founded by E.L. Drury in 1877, acquired in 1957. There was Toronto, the new Carlingview Drive plant in Etobicoke, on a street named after the brewery, which had replaced the old O'Keefe plant at Gould and Victoria when that site was sold to Ryerson in 1966. There was Montreal. There was St. John's. There was, for a while, Edmonton, Walkerville, Ottawa, all the others that had been folded in. A worker arriving at the Vancouver brewery in 1978, and there were about 500 of them on every shift in those years, would walk through the gates at 12th and Arbutus into a 5-story brick building that filled the block. The smell hit first. Wet malt, the sweet bready porridge of it, the steam coming off the mash tuns, the green resinous bite of hops being added to the boil, the warm yeasty tang of fermentation rolling out of the cellars where the temperature was held cool and steady. And underneath all of it, the faintly sour smell of spent grain being hauled out the back loading bay for cattle feed. Inside the building, the sound was layered too. The roar of the brew kettles, the hiss of steam lines, the relentless clatter of the bottling line where bottles moved past at nearly 1,000 a minute, the pneumatic thunk of the crown cappers, the rumble of conveyors, the shout of foremen, the hiss of carbon dioxide from the kegging line. Each plant ran at less than half its theoretical capacity. The Toronto Carling plant, in those years, was running at 40 to 50% of what it could have produced. This was not a flaw in the operation. It was a feature of it. The whole industry was structured around the interprovincial wall. You could not ship Carling Black Label brewed in Toronto into Calgary at a competitive price. So you built a plant in Calgary. Then you built one in Edmonton. Then one in Regina, and Saskatoon, and Winnipeg, and Vancouver. You ran each of them at half capacity. And the math worked, because the law said it had to. The workers in those plants belonged to the Canadian Union of United Brewery, Flour, Cereal, Soft Drink, and Distillery Workers, the National Union, and in British Columbia to Brewery Workers Union, Local 300. The Ontario branch had 4,000 members in the 1980s. Their president in 1983 was a man named Gordon Penderleith. The jobs were union jobs in the fullest sense of the term. Well-paid, benefit-rich, with seniority rights and pensions, and an in-plant tradition of a daily allotment that workers took home in a cardboard case at the end of the shift. The labels on the bottles, by the 1970s, carried a small line of type that read, "Union Made." A father and son could work the same line. A grandfather had often worked it before them. A worker who walked through the gates at Kitsilano in 1978 was walking into the same industry his father had walked into in 1948 and his grandfather in 1928, and into a building, in the case of Vancouver, that had been standing in that spot since the year his grandfather was born. This was the world the merger would end, but the world was not finished yet. Chapter 6. Hey Mabel and the Battle of Quebec. There was a moment, in the autumn of 1983, when you could turn on a television set anywhere in Canada on a Sunday afternoon and watch the Carling O'Keefe Company essentially talking to itself. The Toronto Argonauts, in double blue, were playing in the Grey Cup at BC Place. They were owned by Carling O'Keefe. The game was being broadcast on CBC. The principal sponsor of the broadcast was Carling O'Keefe, paying, by the mid-1980s, something close to $11 million a year for the rights to wrap CFL coverage on both CBC and CTV. The cans of beer in the halftime commercials carried the Carling name. The cans of beer in the hands of the fans in the stands had been brewed at Carlingview Drive. And the Argonauts won that game, the 1983 Grey Cup, the team's first championship in 3 decades. This was Carling O'Keefe at its absolute cultural peak, not as a beer company, as a piece of national infrastructure. Hockey Night in Canada ran on beer money. The CFL ran on beer money. The Montreal Expos played their televised games with O'Keefe as the broadcast sponsor. The brewery had been the first television sponsor of the Expos all the way back in 1969. The Toronto Maple Leafs were owned by Harold Ballard, not by any of the breweries, But the rivalry that defined the National Hockey League through the entire 1980s was a Carling-O'Keefe rivalry, because Carling-O'Keefe owned the Quebec Nordiques. The Nordiques had come into Carling-O'Keefe's ownership around 1976 and 1977, under the team's young president Marcel Aubu, for about $2 million. What followed was the Battle of Quebec. The Nordiques and the Montreal Canadiens, the upstart in Quebec City and the dynasty in Montreal, played each other on Saturday nights through the early 80s in games that drew the largest hockey audiences in Quebec's history. The fights were ferocious. The rivalry was personal. And underneath it, every Quebecer knew exactly what it stood for. Molson owned the Canadiens. Carling-O'Keefe owned the Nordiques. The two corporate rivals were fighting through their hockey teams. The Federalist establishment in Montreal was fighting through the Canadiens. The Quebec nationalist tide was lifting the Nordiques. Two beer companies, two cities, two flags, two visions of Quebec. The Battle of Quebec was about hockey. It was also, in the way that everything in Canada is, about something more than hockey. And the brands themselves were everywhere. Carling Black Label, the workhorse, with its red and gold label that any Canadian over 45 could draw from memory. Old Vienna, just say OV, the budget brand that paid the rent. Carling Red Cap Ale, the top Ontario brand of the 1960s. Black Horse Ale, brewed for the Maritimes. Dow Ale, the Quebec mainstay. Dominion Ale, brewed for Newfoundland. Calgary Beer with its Buffalo and its Horseshoe. Toby. Heidelberg. Carlsberg, brewed in Canada under license from 1973. Miller High Life, licensed in 1981 in response to Labatt's Budweiser deal, sold defiantly in the long-neck American bottle rather than the squat little Canadian stubby, which Carling helped kill in the process. By 1987, Foster's brewed under license from the Australian company Elders IADL. The cultural reach of all this is hard to overstate now. The Hey Mabel Black Label jingle by the early 1980s was 3 decades old and still being whistled by men who hadn't seen the commercial in years. The back bar signs in Legion halls and small-town taverns were lit up Mabel in her red and gold uniform, holding her tray, walking out of a 1949 advertisement and into the present day. The Calgary Beer Buffalo stood watch from kitchen walls and basement bars across the prairies. In Quebec, on a Saturday night, the rivalry between the Nordiques and the Canadiens was, for a working man, also the rivalry between the beer in his fridge and the beer in his brother-in-law's fridge. It was, especially, a blue-collar empire. Labatt was the suburban middle. Molson was the heritage prestige, the brand for the dentist and the dad with the good job at the bank. Carling-O'Keefe was the value and volume brand, the brewery for the men who actually worked in breweries, and for the men who worked in the factories and the rail yards and the docks. Carling's identity was union, working class, blue collar, and that identity was honest. The labels were union-made. The workers in the plants were buying their own beer on Friday night. The company sponsored hockey and football, the sports of a country built by men who worked with their hands. And by 1986, Carling-O'Keefe held about 23% of the Canadian beer market, clear third, behind Labatt and Molson, but still selling more than $1 billion worth of beer a year. There were 16 breweries in the merged Canadian field by then, divided among the 3 companies. Carling's own labels in the United States had been sold off to Heilemann in 1979. But in Canada, the company was as visible as it had ever been. Grey Cup, Stanley Cup, Hockey Night, Saturday afternoon, Saturday evening, Sunday afternoon. The beer, the team, the broadcast, the jingle. The empire was at its summit. And from the summit, the ground beneath it was already moving. Chapter 7. The highest point. If you had stood in the executive offices of Carling-O'Keefe Limited in Toronto in the spring of 1986, you would have looked out at a company that, by every conventional measure, was doing what it had always done. The Carlingview plant was running. The Kitsilano plant in Vancouver was running. So were Calgary, Saskatoon, Winnipeg, Montreal, St. John's. The Nordiques had just played a strong season. The Argonauts were the defending Grey Cup champions from 3 years earlier. The Foster's licensing deal was about to be signed. The Australian beer would start being brewed at Carling plants in April. The brewery network was intact. The workforce was intact. The brands were on every shelf. But the executives in that office knew things that most Canadians didn't. They knew that the company had drifted into a defensive crouch, that while Labatt was building blue and Molson was building Canadian into true national brands, Carling O'Keefe had continued to operate as a series of regional breweries with lesser emphasis on national branding. They knew that the great historic ales, Black Horse, Dow, Dominion, were being rationalized out of the portfolio in the mid-80s. They knew that Redcap, once Ontario's #1 beer, was sliding. They knew the Toronto plant was running at less than half its capacity. They knew the interprovincial wall, the very wall that had built the whole brewery network, was starting to look, to anyone who was paying attention, like a wall that could not stand forever. And they knew that the company they worked for was no longer Canadian. In 1969, 4 years after Taylor had resigned as chairman, Canadian breweries had been sold to Rothmans of Pall Mall, Canada, the Canadian arm of the British Tobacco Company. Rothmans Inc. had taken 50 1/10%. In 1973, under Rothmans' ownership, the company had renamed itself Carling O'Keefe Limited, after its two best-known subsidiaries. Plants in Ottawa and Quebec and Cleveland had been closed. Brands had been rationalized. The British Tobacco Company had run the Canadian Beer Company at arm's length, a portfolio asset rather than an industrial commitment. And in February 1987, in the middle of 48 hours of closed-door meetings in Toronto, Rothmans International notified its Canadian subsidiary that the 50 1/10% stake had been sold. The buyer was Elders IHL Limited, the Australian conglomerate based in Melbourne, owner of Foster's Lager and Carlton and United Breweries. Their director of strategy, Andrew Cummins, flew to Toronto and offered $18 a share. The trading price was a little over 17.5. The controlling block changed hands for roughly $196 million. The chairman of Elders, a 45-year-old former McKinsey consultant named John Elliott, told reporters that the Canadian purchase was one more step in the process of becoming the largest brewer in the world. The workers on the floor at Carlingview, and at Kitsilano, and at Calgary, and Saskatoon, and Winnipeg did not yet know what that sentence meant. They knew, abstractly, that they had a new owner. They knew the beer was still being brewed. They knew the lines were still running. What they did not know, could not have known, was that the man who had just bought their company believed, and would shortly say in public, that the Canadian brewing industry was one of the most inefficient industries in the world. That Canada had far too many plants. That those plants had been built up by regulation over many years. And that something would have to be done about that. It was 1987. The Canada-United States Free Trade Agreement was a year away from signature. The interprovincial wall, which had built the whole brewery network, was about to be tested as it had never been tested before. The Quebec Nordiques were on the ice. The Argonauts were on the field. The Hey Mabel jingle was still being whistled. The brewery whistle still blew at the change of every shift. These were the last good years. And nobody on the brewery floor, not the men in Vancouver lifting cases off the line, not the women in the bottling hall at Carlingview, not the brewmasters in Calgary watching the kettles come up to temperature on a Monday morning, could see from where they were standing what was already moving toward them out of the boardrooms of Melbourne and Montreal. The empire was at the highest point it would ever reach, and the ground was already moving. Chapter 8. Tobacco, then Foster's. The seeds of what was coming had been planted decades earlier, but they only began to grow in the second half of the 1980s. The first of them was structural. The interprovincial wall, the regulation that required each province's beer to be brewed inside that province, had built the brewery network, and it had also, by the 1980s, become the network's curse. There were 16 breweries owned by the Big Three across the country, most of them running at less than half their theoretical capacity. The math was no longer sustainable. Labatt had begun consolidating. Molson had begun consolidating. Carling O'Keefe, the third and weakest of the three, had less room to maneuver and less appetite for closures. The second seed was the brand portfolio. Where Labatt had built Blue and Molson had built Canadian into true national flagships, Carling O'Keefe had spent the 1970s and early 1980s defending a long tail of regional brands and licensing other people's beer to fill the gaps. Carlsberg had come in 1973. Tuborg had come the same year. Miller High Life had come in 1981. Foster's had come in April 1986. None of them were Carling brands. None of them belonged, finally, to the company brewing them. By the mid-1980s, the company's own historic ales, Black Horse, Dow, Dominion, were being rationalized out of the portfolio. The man on the loading dock at Carlingview was loading cases of someone else's beer. The third seed was foreign ownership. By the time the 1980s arrived, Carling O'Keefe was no longer a Canadian company in any meaningful sense. Rothmans of Pall Mall, Canada, the British tobacco group, had held control since 1969. The renaming in 1973 had been a marketing decision made by tobacco executives. The closures in Ottawa and Quebec and Cleveland had been decided by men who did not work in the brewing industry. Carling O'Keefe was a portfolio asset. It was managed at arm's length. And in February 1987, after 48 hours of closed-door meetings in Toronto, it was sold again. This time to Elders Dayetdel of Melbourne, the Australian conglomerate that owned Foster's Lager, and Carlton and United Breweries. The buying price for the controlling block was roughly $196 million. The man who bought it was John Elliott. He was 45 years old. He had joined McKinsey out of business school in 1966. He had taken control of an Adelaide jam maker called IXL in 1972 and built it, through a decade of debt-funded acquisitions, into one of the largest conglomerates in Australia. He had taken over Carlton and United Breweries in 1983. He was the federal president of the Australian Liberal Party. He was the president of the Carlton Football Club. He was, by 1987, a famous man at home, satirized on a comedy program clutching a Foster's can and saying "pig's arse" in a thick Melbourne accent. And he had a strategy. The Canadian purchase, he told reporters, was one more step in the process of becoming the largest brewer in the world. The point of Carling O'Keefe, for Elders, was not the Canadian beer market. The point was a platform, a North American beachhead for global distribution of Foster's Lager. In the same month, the Canadian government was negotiating a free trade agreement with the United States. The agreement would be signed by Brian Mulroney on the 2nd of January 1988 and would come into effect on the 1st of January 1989. Beer would, in the end, be exempted from the agreement. But the political climate around it changed everything. The argument that protectionism had built Canadian industry and that protectionism was now ending was no longer a question in the abstract. It was happening. And the men who ran Carling O'Keefe, and the men who ran Molson, and the men who ran Labatt were all looking at the same arithmetic. 16 plants, less than half capacity, the interprovincial wall starting to crack. And, somewhere out there in the larger argument about free trade and competitiveness and globalization, the slow public legitimation of the idea that Canadian industry would have to consolidate or die. John Elliott put it more bluntly than anyone else dared. Speaking to reporters in 1988, he called the Canadian brewing industry one of the most inefficient in the world. Canada, he said, had far too many plants, which had been built up by regulation over a number of years. The implication was unmistakable. The plants would have to go. The workers on the floor at Kitsilano and at Carlingview and at the Calgary Brewery and the Saskatoon plant and the St. John's plant and the Montreal plant. They read those quotes in the paper. They understood what they meant. The union halls knew what they meant. But the union halls also knew that closing breweries was not a simple thing. The CFL broadcasts still ran the Carling commercials. The Nordiques still played at Le Colisée. The Mabel signs still glowed in the bars. The beer still moved out the loading bay every morning. And the same company that had survived 2 world wars and 2 prohibitions and the Depression and a federal combine prosecution had a way of surviving things. Except this time, the company itself was no longer trying to survive. It was looking for a partner. In the summer and autumn of 1988, the senior executives of Carling O'Keefe and the senior executives of Molson began having quiet conversations. The Quebec Nordiques were sold in 1988 to a group led by Marcel Aubu, because, the company explained, the situation could not continue once the talks progressed. Molson owned the Canadiens, and you could not own both teams in the same league. The Toronto Argonauts were sold at the end of 1988 to a businessman from Vancouver named Harry Ornest for about $5 million. The cultural empire was being quietly unwound. The hockey team was gone. The football team was gone. The sponsorships were being divested. What was left was the brewing operation. And in the boardrooms of Montreal and Toronto, the men in dark suits were doing the math one final time. Chapter 9, January 18, 1989. The announcement came on the morning of Wednesday, the 18th of January, 1989. It was made jointly by Marshall Cohen, known to everyone as Mickey, the former senior federal civil servant who had been hired the previous year as president and chief executive of the Molson companies, by Eric Molson, the family principal who represented the seventh generation of the Montreal brewing dynasty, by John Carroll, the president of Molson Breweries, and by John Elliott in by telephone from Australia. The Molson companies and Elders I et al. Would merge their Canadian brewing operations into a 50-50 joint venture. The new entity would be called Molson Breweries of Canada Limited. It would keep the Molson name. It would have, on the day it was incorporated, 52.5% of the Canadian beer market, leapfrogging Labatt, which had been the country's largest brewer for years, and making the new company the sixth largest in North America and one of the 20 largest in the world. The Globe and Mail called it the biggest and most audacious deal in Canadian brewing history. Combined sales of nearly $2 billion American dollars. For Mickey Cohen, the rationale was the math. The partnership, he told reporters that morning, represented a major investment and a long-term commitment to the Canadian brewing industry. For John Carroll, who would run the merged operation, it was about efficiency, about being able to compete internally and externally. For Eric Molson, it was about the survival of a company his family had owned for more than 200 years. For John Elliott, in Melbourne, it was about the Global Foster's platform, Canadian production capacity that could send beer south into the United States, and brewing scale that could be folded into the larger Elders portfolio. The Mulroney government's Competition Bureau would review the deal, given the combined 52% market share. The review would, in time, approve it. But the announcement of the merger was not in itself the thing that ended Carling O'Keefe. The merger was a financial transaction. What followed the merger was the thing. On Wednesday, the 25th of January, 1989, exactly 1 week after the joint venture was announced, the new company confirmed that 7 of the 16 Canadian breweries it now owned would close over the following 3 years. 1,400 jobs would be eliminated. 900 of those would go through attrition and early retirement. 500 would be full-time positions eliminated outright. The plants that would close were specified by name. From the old Molson network, Lethbridge, Winnipeg, and the downtown Toronto plant. From the old Carling O'Keefe network, Saskatoon, St. John's, Vancouver, Montreal. The Barrie plant in Ontario would remain. $185 million would be invested in upgrading the surviving plants. The decisions had been made in Toronto and Montreal, and by long-distance phone call, in Melbourne. They landed in the affected cities the way these decisions always landed. As a press release, followed by a notification to the union, followed by a town hall meeting in which men and women who had worked for the brewery for 10, 15, 20, 30 years were told, in language that was carefully composed and humanely delivered, that the calculation had been run and they were on the wrong side of it. The merged company's reasoning was not malicious. It was not even, in its own terms, wrong. The Toronto Carling plant on Carlingview Drive was running at 40 to 50% capacity. The Vancouver plant at Kitsilano had been built in 1912 and was, by the standards of late 20th century brewing, an antique. The Saskatoon plant was small. The Montreal plant duplicated Molson's own Quebec capacity. The Newfoundland plant served a small market. By every conventional metric of industrial efficiency, The plants on the closure list were less productive than the plants that would remain. The math worked. But the math was only the math. The math did not measure the brewmaster in Saskatoon who had worked at the plant for 26 years. The math did not measure the father and son at Carlingview, the second-generation worker whose dad had punched in at the same gate in 1958. The math did not measure the bottling line workers at Kitsilano who had been there since the late 60s, who had paid mortgages and raised children on the wages the brewery paid, who had been told that the brewery would always be there because the brewery had always been there. The math did not measure the loyalty. The math did not measure the trade. The fact that thousands of unionized brewing jobs in cities across the country had been built on the implicit assumption that a Carling O'Keefe job was a permanent thing, the kind of job your son or daughter could grow up expecting to take after you. The math, in the end, was the math of a corporate joint venture serving its shareholders. Half the shareholders were the Molson family of Montreal. Half were a tobacco-derived British holding structure and an Australian conglomerate run out of Melbourne. None of them lived in Kitsilano. None of them lived in Saskatoon. None of them had punched in at the gate at Carlingview at 6 in the morning in February and felt the cold come in off the parking lot. The math worked because the math did not have to feel that cold. In Toronto, Mickey Cohen explained the closures with the measured tone of a man who had been preparing the explanation for weeks. In Melbourne, John Elliott, by all accounts pleased, told the Australian press that the merger gave Elders precisely the North American platform he had been looking for since 1987. In Montreal, Eric Molson said that the long-term viability of the Canadian brewing industry had been secured. In the brewing union halls in Vancouver and Saskatoon and St. John's and Montreal, the response was different. Gordon Penderleith and his successors in the Canadian Union of United Brewery, Flour, Cereal, Soft Drink, and Distillery Workers issued the statements that union leaders issue at moments like this. They called the closures unnecessary. They called the workforce reductions unjust. They called for the government to intervene. The government did not intervene. The Free Trade Agreement had come into effect 3 weeks before the merger announcement, on the 1st of January, 1989. Beer had been exempted from the agreement. The merger was not driven by free trade. But the political climate that had made free trade possible, the argument that Canadian industry must consolidate, modernize, scale up, or face extinction, was the same political climate that made the merger feel, to the men who designed it, like a sensible response to the structural problems of an industry built on protectionist regulation. The plants would now close. The order of closure would be set out in a schedule. The first to go would be the Saskatoon plant, at the end of 1989. Chapter 10. Closing the doors. A brewery doesn't close all at once. It closes the way a body cools, slowly, then all at once. The lines run shorter shifts. The orders shrink. The bottling hall, which had been running 3 shifts at peak, drops to 2 and then to 1. The cellars hold less beer than they used to. The maintenance crew is reassigned. The brewmaster, the man who has known every kettle and every fermenter in the building for 2 decades, is told that there will be no need for a brewmaster after the end of the year. The trucks come and go for spare parts and equipment that is being transferred to a plant that will still be running. And then, on a date that everyone has known about for months, the last shift finishes its work and walks out the gate. The Saskatoon plant closed on the 31st of December, 1989. It was a small plant, over 40 employees. The descendants, by way of corporate mergers and acquisitions, of the old Drury's Brewery. Canadian brewing history reaching back to 1927 in that city, and a brewery culture in Saskatoon that the workers had inherited and were now being told to put down. The Vancouver plant at Kitsilano went next. The brewery at 12th and Arbutus, the 5-story brick building that had been making beer on that block since 1912, was sold to Molson in 1990. Production was wound down. The line stopped. The plant was demolished in 1995. On the land where the brewery had stood, the malting tower, the rail sidings, the loading docks, the bottling halls, the cellars, the developer built Arbutus Walk, 1,000 condominiums and townhomes that came onto the market in 1996. A reconstructed brick tower stands on the site today. A small bronze plaque on it honors the brewmasters and workers who once worked there. You can stand in front of it on a Saturday morning in October and watch the city go by. Joggers, dog walkers, families pushing strollers, a young couple unloading groceries from a car. None of them know what stood here. None of them know that 500 unionized workers used to walk through gates that no longer exist, into a building that no longer exists, to make a beer that no longer exists. The brick tower is the only thing that remembers. The Montreal Carling O'Keefe plant closed. The St. John's plant closed. The Calgary Brewery, the original Calgary Brewing and Malting Company, founded by A.E. Cross in 1892, the Buffalo and Horseshoe Brewery, survived a few years longer. Molson relaunched Calgary beer for the brewery's centennial in 1992. The brewery was decommissioned in 1994. The Winnipeg Redwood plant, E.L. Drury's old brewery from 1877, 55 Redwood Avenue, the Carling plant that had survived the 1989 list, kept running until 1997, when it too closed. The building was demolished in 1999. The Carling View Drive plant in Etobicoke survived. The street still carries the name. The plant continued as a Molson brewery into the years that followed. The buildings that had once held thousands of brewing workers across the country had, in the space of a single decade, been reduced to a handful of survivors. 1,400 jobs. Some of the workers retired. Some took the transfer to another city, usually a long way from home, usually a wrench on a family with kids in school and a mortgage and a spouse with their own job. Some went on to unemployment, the men in their 50s, and they were mostly men in the cellars and the bottling lines and the maintenance crews, had brewing skills that were no longer being demanded anywhere. The men in their 30s retrained or didn't. The men who had been father and son at the brewery now had no brewery to be father and son at. Mickey Cohen would later be praised in Canadian business journalism for the discipline of the merger and the rationalization. John Elliott would resign as chairman and chief executive of Elders in 1990. Elders IXL would be renamed Foster's Brewing Group. Elliott would be declared bankrupt in January 2005. He would die some years later, his fortune gone, his reputation reduced to the football club he had loved and the comedy program that had once satirized him. E.P. Taylor died at Lyford Cay on the 14th of May, 1989, 4 months after the merger announcement, 3 months after the 7 plants had been put on the closure list, a month before the first of those plants would actually shut its doors. He had not been to Canada in 9 years. He had had a stroke in 1980. There is no record that anyone told him about the merger, the empire he had built by trading paper for paper, by closing more than 100 brands down to 6, by firing the runners and hiring the salesmen, by buying the breweries in London and Toronto and rolling them into a continental colossus. That empire was being dismantled by the same logic he had used to build it. And he died, in a club he had built on an island in the Bahamas, very probably without knowing. The last shift at any of the closing plants would have looked the same, the line slowing. The brewmaster checking the temperature of the kettles one final time. The bottling supervisor counting the last case off the line. The men and women on the floor signing pieces of paper, sometimes a label, sometimes a wooden case, sometimes a fragment of the line itself, with names and dates and years of service. 22 years, 26, 31. Outside, the parking lot, the trucks that wouldn't be coming tomorrow. The whistle, for those plants that still had a whistle, blew one last time at the change of the shift. And then the cellars went quiet, and the brewing kettles cooled, and the long sound of a Canadian brewery, the hum and clatter that had been part of the city's own acoustic for decades, was gone. Chapter 11. The original 16 and the tower in the condos. 16 workers at the Saskatoon plant decided not to walk away. In the months between the merger announcement in January 1989 and the closure at the end of the year, the company had given the affected employees 2 options. Transfer to another city, take a severance package, and be out of a job. The transfers, for many of the Saskatoon workers, were not practical. They had houses in Saskatoon. They had families in Saskatoon. They had been brewing in Saskatoon for years. Moving to Regina, or to Edmonton, or further afield, meant uprooting a life that had been built around a building they were now being told would no longer be there. 16 of them chose a third option. They were going to buy the plant. The leaders included a former Saskatoon firefighter named Ian Senteri, who had been born in England and immigrated to Canada in 1980 and worked at the brewery ever since. They included a man named Bill McLeod. They included Greg Kitts. They included Donna Lash. There were 12 others, the rest of the 16, whose names are not all in the public record, but whose decision was the same. They were going to use their severance payouts, the money the company was giving them to walk away, to buy the building they had just been told to walk out of. They would partner with the Saskatchewan Economic Development Corporation, the Crown investment arm, which would take a roughly 20% stake in the venture. They would raise the rest. They would buy the plant from Molson for about $5 million, and they would start a new brewery. Ian Senteri, years later, would describe the decision to a CBC reporter with the dry clarity of a man who knew exactly what had been at stake. Depending on how long you had worked at O'Keefe's, he said, you got a payout, so you were using that money to reinvest in the brewery. It was a hard decision, because you have money in hand, or you use that money and take a huge chance. They took the chance. The first beers of the new company, Great Western Brewing, came off the line in March 1990, 3 months after Molson had shut the brewery down for the last time. The flagship brand would, in time, be named Original 16, in honor of the 16 workers who had refused to walk away. The Saskatchewan Crown investment was sold for $4 million in 2002. Great Western kept brewing. As the Canadian craft beer revival of the 1990s and 2000s gathered momentum, Great Western was already there. The only major prairie brewery not owned by Molson or Labatt, the People's Brewery that had been bought back from the merger. On the 25th anniversary of the buyback, in 2015, CBC ran a story about the company. 4 of the original 16 were still working at the plant on 2nd Avenue North. A photograph showed Ian Senteri and Bill McLeod toasting a quarter-century of brewing success. People wrote us off way back in '89, Senteri told the reporter, saying it's never going to work. And here we are. Greg Kitts put it another way. This was our baby, he said. We were there at the conception, the birth, and through its growing pains. It is the one place where the story of Carling O'Keefe has a kind of redemption. Of the 7 plants that closed in the merger, 6 were demolished or repurposed and forgotten. 1, the smallest, in a prairie city far from the boardrooms in Toronto and Montreal and Melbourne, became something else. Saskatoon kept brewing. The workers had refused to let it stop. Of the other plants, what remains is mostly absence. The Vancouver brewery at Kitsilano is Arbutus Walk now, 1,000 units of condominium and townhouse housing on the block that used to hold the brewery. The reconstructed brick tower stands at the entrance. The plaque names the brewmasters and the workers. The kettles and the bottling lines and the cellars and the loading docks are gone. The 500 unionized jobs are gone. The smell of malt and hops that used to settle over Kitsilano on a brewing morning is gone. The block looks like every other gentrified inner-city neighborhood in any North American city. Coffee shops, yoga studios, mid-rise residential, a few preserved facades that nobody has the time to read. The brick tower is the marker. Somebody chose to put it there. Somebody decided that the workers who had built that brewery and brewed in it for almost a century deserved a small piece of brick and a small piece of bronze. They were right. The Carlingview plant in Etobicoke continued as a Molson brewery. The Winnipeg Redwood site was demolished in 1999. The Calgary Brewery's Buffalo statue was preserved by the developer who took over the site. The Montreal plant became part of the city's redeveloped industrial landscape. The St. John's plant closed and was repurposed. The Carling O'Keefe brand, as a corporate entity, ceased to exist. 3 of its beers, Carling Lager, Carling Black Label, and O'Keefe's Blonde Ale, survive in the Molson Coors Canada portfolio, more nostalgic survivors than living brands. Carling Black Label has had an extraordinary second life as the top-selling beer in South Africa, where it is universally known by its nickname, Zamalek. In Britain, Carling, licensed from the original company in 1952, eventually integrated into the European operations of Bass Charrington, and now Molson Coors Europe, was the best-selling draft beer in the country from 1985 until 2024, when it was overtaken by Birra Moretti. The brand the Yorkshire farmer brought across the Atlantic in 1818 is now an Italian-owned lager in his old country. The strange routes that beer takes. Eugene O'Keeffe's old plant at Gould and Victoria in Toronto was demolished in the 1960s. Ryerson University, now Toronto Metropolitan University, built on the site. The Performing Arts Center that O'Keeffe's estate endowed in 1960, the O'Keeffe Center, has been renamed twice. It is now Meridian Hall. The seminary at the Scarborough Bluffs that O'Keeffe paid $400,000 to build still stands and is still in use. The church for the Polish community that he bought in 1911, St. Stanislaus Kostka, still stands. The brewery is gone. The philanthropy remains. The craft beer revival that Great Western had quietly anticipated would, by the 2010s, reshape Canadian brewing into something almost unrecognizable from the 1965 oligopoly. Hundreds of microbreweries opened in cities and towns across the country. Vancouver, where the Kitsilano plant had once been the only brewery for miles, became home to dozens of small craft producers. The Big Three, consolidated into Molson Coors, and the international holding company that bought Labatt, still moved the largest volumes, but the beer drinkers had changed. The country that had drunk Carling Black Label and Old Vienna and Calgary beer in the 1970s was now drinking IPAs and saisons and sours and small-batch lagers from breweries with names nobody had heard of 10 years earlier. In Saskatoon, the brewery on 2nd Avenue North still operates. Great Western, the brewery that the original 16 bought back. The bridge between the old industry and the new one. The one place where a Canadian brewery, told it would close, became something else instead. The other plants are quiet. The men who worked in them are old now, or they are gone. The fathers and sons of Carlingview and Kitsilano and Calgary and Redwood Avenue and St. John's and Montreal, the second and third generations of brewing families, found other work or didn't, retrained or didn't, stayed in their cities or left them. The good union job at the brewery, which had been one of the great Canadian working-class institutions of the 20th century, was over. Eugene O'Keeffe was buried in Toronto in 1913. Thomas Carling was buried in London in 1880. E.P. Taylor was buried in the Bahamas in 1989. John Elliott was buried in Melbourne in 2021. None of them lived to see what happens to a brewery town when the brewery closes, except Taylor, who probably never knew. The men who built the empire and the men who dismantled it never had to stand in the parking lot in February. The empire fell not through one failure. It fell through a long series of choices, each one defensible on its own terms, each one made by men in rooms far from the brewing floor. The British tobacco purchase in 1969, the renaming in 1973, the Australian purchase in 1987, the free trade context, the merger of January 1989, the closures of the 7 plants. Each decision, in its boardroom, looked like an answer to a real problem. The combined effect was the end of a Canadian industrial institution. The brick tower stands in Kitsilano. The plaque names the workers. The brewery on 2nd Avenue North in Saskatoon is still brewing. And somewhere, in the back of a bar in a small town in Ontario or Manitoba or Newfoundland, a battered tin sign still hangs on the wall. Mabel, in her red and gold uniform, holding her tray, looking out at a room that has long since stopped whistling her name. The beer is gone. The empire is gone. The good union job at the brewery is gone. The whistle does not blow at the change of the shift.